first noticed Ethan by the way the afternoon seemed to pool around him, heavy and unspent. He would drift past my shop with the slow shuffle of someone who had misplaced his purpose, hood up even on warm days, eyes lowered to the glow of a screen. The town moved at a modest pace, but he moved slower, as if time itself avoided him. I watched this rhythm for weeks while oiling tiny gears and easing stubborn springs back to life. Inside my shop, every tick had a task. Outside, Ethan's hours fell like quiet snow, soft and vanishing. He lived 3 doors down, with a mother who left early and returned late. On mornings when I raised the blinds, I sometimes saw his window still lit from the night. The glow looked like a small moon that refused to set. By noon, he might appear on the sidewalk, hair uncombed, shoulders folded, carrying the faint impatience of someone who had slept through alarms meant for a different version of himself. The sadness of it crept in like cold under a door. There is a particular ache in watching a young person drift, like seeing a river choose to circle a quiet eddy instead of following its own current. I measured his days the way I measure a clock's heartbeat. Missed classes accumulated like dust under a mantle. Assignments slid by, unclaimed. He seemed to prefer the steady reward of small distractions to the uncertain promise of effort. People passed him without seeing, and perhaps that suited him. It pained me more than I expected. When a clock refuses to start, I feel responsible. When a boy refuses to start, I feel something larger than responsibility, something closer to a debt owed to time itself. One gray afternoon, he stopped outside my door and studied the faded lettering on the glass. The shop smelled of cedar and brass, and the kind of patience that machines request from the hands that mend them. He looked at the shelves where clocks rested with their faces tilted upward, as if asking the ceiling for courage. His gaze drifted to the long case by the counter, whose pendulum had fallen silent the week before. I felt that familiar dip in the chest, the moment when hope feels thin as a dry leaf. Yet there he was, anchored for once, not drifting. I lifted the counter gate and stepped into the quiet between us. The room held the stillness that arrives before the first tick. In that pause, I understood that time had offered us both an opening, a small seam in the day where something might be stitched back together. Ethan's first mornings in the shop were clumsy ones. He arrived late, smelling faintly of sleep, and eyed the benches crowded with tools as if they were written in a language he had no desire to learn. I gave him small tasks at first, dusting shelves, lining up loose screws in their compartments. But each one came with a quiet condition. It had to be done with care, not speed. He didn't understand why at first. To him, dust was dust, screws were just screws. But I wanted him to see what I had learned long ago, that attention is a form of respect, and respect is how you make time feel worth keeping. He grumbled, but his hands were steady enough. I noticed that when he forgot to think about how long something might take, he lingered over the work. His fingertips traced the curve of a clock's casing, as if feeling for its pulse. It was in those moments, brief and rare, that I saw a thread connecting him to something outside himself. One day, I handed him a brass carriage clock with a frozen mechanism. It was nothing precious in value, but to me, it was a test. I told him to open the back and watch the gears move, or rather, try to move. He crouched under the bench lamp, squinting at the tiny teeth that refused to catch. I explained how each gear relied on the others, how one lazy turn could bring the whole thing to a halt. His eyes flicked up at me when I said lazy, but he didn't speak. Instead, he bent closer. That week, I began giving him timed tasks, polishing a casing before the chime struck, organizing the drawers before the minute hand reached 12. He missed his marks often at first. Sometimes he'd stop halfway, distracted by his phone, and I'd hear the muffled ping of a game starting. But slowly the phone stayed in his pocket longer. He began to anticipate the chime, his hands moving with more purpose. The first time he finished on time, he looked almost startled, as if he had stumbled into an unfamiliar kind of victory. Outside, his friends called for him less. The afternoons of wandering aimlessly seemed to shrink. Here in the shop, his hours had weight. I saw it in the way he paused before locking the door at closing, glancing at the rows of clocks as if they were quietly approving his effort. He didn't say it aloud, but I could feel him learning. Every tick is a chance to choose, and every choice shapes the hours that follow. The old long case clock by the counter had been silent for years, its pendulum resting like a question with no answer. I had left it untouched, partly because its repair would take more time than I cared to admit, and partly because I thought of it as a reminder that not everything must be hurried back to life. But as Ethan's days in the shop gathered weight, I began to see it differently. One evening, when the last customer had left and the street outside was turning gold with sunset, I told him it was time to bring the clock back. His eyes widened. This was not a dusting job or a polish timed to a chime. This was work that would ask for patience, stitched to patience, and then stitched again. We opened the case and found the inside dulled with age, the chain tangled, the gear teeth worn. I guided his hands at first, showing him how to ease each piece apart, clean it, and return it without rushing. Hours slipped by in the quiet rhythm of cloth over brass, oil on steel, the gentle turn of a screwdriver. He didn't ask how long it would take. He simply worked. Days passed, and each morning he came without prompting. No late arrivals now. The boy who once avoided effort was leaning over the bench before I had even poured my tea. He no longer glanced at the clock to see when the day would end. He was watching it to see what could be done before it did. The change was not loud or dramatic. It was like the slow turning of a gear you don't notice until the hands have moved. The afternoon the clock finally stirred. The sound was almost shy. A small, deliberate tick, followed by another. Ethan stepped back, eyes fixed on the swinging pendulum. I told him it was his work that had woken it. He smiled then, not the quick, uncertain smile of someone expecting it to fade, but the kind that grows from knowing you have given time a reason to move again. That night, as he left, the street lamps flickered on, casting thin halos on the pavement. He walked with his head up, hands in his pockets, the slow shuffle gone. I stood in the doorway, listening to the steady ticking inside the shop and the quieter ticking I imagined in his chest. Time had not given him more hours. It had simply shown him how to fill the ones he had. There's a kind of wealth that can't be counted in coins or possessions. It lives in the hours we choose to honor, in the moments we give our full attention. Ethan learned that the value of time isn't in how much of it we're handed, but in what we decide to build inside it. We can let it slip, soft and unmarked, or we can shape it into something that lasts beyond the day. If this story spoke to you, share it with someone who needs it, and remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more tales that linger after the last word.